Hello, today I want to answer the question of why did the communists win the war in China. Here you can see the territories that were controlled by the communists in 1941, and those were roughly the same territories that the communists controlled in 1937, just before the Japanese Empire waged a full-scale war on China. And actually here you can see the territories controlled by the communists in 1945. So these are the guerrilla areas within the nationalist China. But what's important to mention is that the ratio of communists versus nationalists before Japanese waged a full-scale war in 1937 was 60 to 1 in favor of the nationalists. But in 1945 it was 3 to 1. And that's much better, that's insanely better, but still it looked like the nationalists would win, but that didn't happen. And what makes the communist victory even weirder, at least on the surface, is the fact that it was actually Chiang Kai-shek that negotiated with Western powers that the Chinese soil, he negotiated the Chinese soil to be returned to China, and the actually Western colonialists gave back their interest spheres to the Chinese people, and that event was even celebrated by Mao Zedong because it was a great victory for China and for Chiang. And what also needs to be said is that the nationalists were actually the ones that fought Japan the hardest, and they were the only ones that engaged in large-scale battles with Japan, unlike the communists who mostly just waged a guerrilla warfare against them. But why is it then that the communists were more popular with the Chinese masses than the nationalists that actually spent many more of their time and resources fighting the Japanese, and it was their diplomacy that actually liberated China from colonialism, with the exception of Hong Kong, that also needs to be mentioned. But yeah, okay, but uh, let me begin by just repeating the observation that is shared both by Edgar Snow and Jung Chang, and that is that the Japanese invasion completely changed the position of the Chinese Communist Party within China. Mao actually at the time hoped that Japan occupies a, a, a lot of nationalist territory, and then his plan was to wage a guerrilla warfare against the Japanese Empire. And in waging a guerrilla war, communists were much more skilled than the nationalists. Well, firstly, because the communists actually spent 10 years fighting a more technologically superior and numerically superior enemy, and those were the nationalists. So all the experience that Mao had during the Long March and his people and his commanders, those experiences were very useful in fighting against the Japanese, and the nationalists simply didn't have that experience, and they were also their control of China was mostly based on controlling large cities, and it was much easier to control the cities for Japan than to control the countryside. And in the countryside, the communists were even more popular because of their program of land redistribution. And what's interesting is that in the Chinese Revolution, unlike the Soviet Revolution, the people in the cities, the proletariat in the cities, was actually not that important. It was actually quite insignificant, and Mao's revolution was won almost entirely by by the peasants. And Here you can see the Japanese army actually attacking on bicycles. Yeah, that actually did happen. It's a real picture. And what I also want to mention to you to help you visualize the brutality of the Japanese invasion was the bombing of Chongqing. That's the Chinese city, and it is also a most heavily bombarded city in the entire world. And when you look at the tonnage of bombs dropped on that city, 1/3 of all bombs dropped on Japan are the equivalent of all the bombs that Japan dropped on this one city in China. And it was at the time a place where Chiang Kai-shek was, and uh, Japan was trying to annihilate the center of nationalist China, which is why they bombed it so heavily. Yeah, here you can see the map, and here is how Chongqing looks today. It's also famous for having a horizontal skyscraper. Well, at least today, it has a horizontal skyscraper. But what I also want to share with you is when Japan attacked, many in the Communist Central Committee kind of naively hoped that now Chinese people can finally unite and wage a brotherly war against a foreign enemy. And one of the people in the Central Committee said to Mao, can we now finally wage a war like we waged it against the Mongols, where the Chinese people will be united against the foreign enemy? And Mao said, no, comrades, this is the war of the three kingdoms, not the war against the Mongols. And Mao, because he was a history teacher before, liked Chinese history very much, and for him this was a war of three kingdoms. And he actually sought to exploit the opportunity to weaken Chiang Kai-shek and let him fight big battles against Japan. And while Chiang is fighting them, he would fight a guerrilla warfare. And the communists generally did not engage in large-scale operations against Japan, with the exception of the 100 Regiments offensive. And that was actually a very significant operation. It prevented the Japanese army from occupying Sichuan, one of the most prosperous regions in China, and it saved the nationalists, and the action was even widely celebrated by the nationalists. But yeah, it is the only major Chinese communist operation against Japan, which is probably why still in 2015 the Chinese state still makes movies about this operation. And operation was done by this guy, Peng, and he actually was never ordered by Mao Zedong to do it. He did it on his own. He was the commander of the 8th Communist Army. And what he did was quite impressive. I mean, here you can see he blew up almost 500 kilometers of railway and more than 1,000 cable posts. And what's most important, he destroyed the mines in Xinjiang, and the entire Japanese state of Manchukuo, uh, that's the area of Manchuria, was dependent on the coal mines that were now destroyed and buried by the communists for half a year. And the Japanese war machine in Manchuria was unable to use coal for half a year. And the communists also killed somewhere around 20,000 Japanese. And after that, the Japanese are enraged and they decide to wage conquests of annihilation against the communists, which is also something that helps Chiang, because now they mobilize their troops to fight the communist guerrilla fighters. And prior to this operation, in some areas, communists even collaborated with the Japanese. In what sense? In a sense that they send them uh, the data about the Chinese nationalists, and in return the Japanese didn't attack them. But after this operation, the Japanese for a while they tried to exterminate communists in different areas of China, but then they decided to return back to fighting the nationalists, because even the Japanese saw Chiang as their primary enemy because he was the more powerful one, and Chiang actually didn't have a choice like Mao to just stand by and wage a guerrilla war. And that's why at the end of the World War II, it was actually the nationalist military that lacked experienced commanders, because they were almost all killed during the Japanese offensives, while on the other hand, Chinese military, the communist military, had a solid number of highly skilled commanders. And here you can see the famous operation in 1940. And what's also interesting is that Mao was able even to use ultra-nationalist arguments against the nationalists themselves. So he accused them of being allied to the same colonial powers that oppressed China for 100 years, which was true. And Mao famously, after uniting China, said the Chinese people have stood up. And here you can see the Opium Wars, and the communists also became popular because they outlawed the opium consumption in their regions. And yeah, so what's interesting is that and yeah, the communists were also loved because of the pro-Soviet sentiment that the Chinese people had at the time, because the Soviet Russia was only great power to significantly help the Chinese war effort, and especially in the period before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and I'm talking about the period between 1937 and 1939. In that period, Stalin actually manages to destroy 2,000 Japanese planes over China, and he sends 1,000 Soviet planes to protect the Chinese skies. And no wonder Russia, or when I say Russia, I'm talking about the Soviet Union, was very popular, unlike the Western colonial powers that also ended up helping China, but only in a later stage. And yeah, and the Soviet decision to give Manchuria to Mao Zedong is also something that greatly helped Mao Zedong. And and yeah, a great example of how Chinese people saw Western colonial powers is actually a old Bruce Lee movie, where Bruce Lee is trying to enter a park and he's stopped by the Western imperialists.
Hello, what do you want? Papa? No, no, not allowed, I'm afraid. Papa?
And finally, one of the main reasons for the failure of Chiang is the fact that he was unable to control inflation in his area, unlike Mao, who actually managed to control it, which I really didn't expect Mao to be good at controlling economy, especially if you know what he did later with the Great Leap Forward. But yeah, the communists are actually better at controlling inflation, according to Archie Brown. And Chiang was also worse at controlling corruption within his own ranks, and his family personally stole millions of dollars from the United States that were sent to the nationalists to help them in their war effort against the communists and against Japan. And finally, Edgar Snow made this bold prediction in the late 1930s that in a country with such inequality, an ideology like communism simply has to win. And I'm actually amazed by the fact that he managed to predict it in a period when communists were outnumbered 60 to 1. But yeah, and it was probably because of that anti-Western sentiment and because of all of the above mentioned reasons that communism is actually still a in a different form, but still a mainstream ideology in China today.